Hey everyone, George Christie here with Wine Industry Network. Welcome to session 2 of the inaugural packXplore, our first packaging conference. Now this session is titled Sustainability and Packaging Practice. And of course, sustainability is something that we continue to talk more and more about in our industry, and we should be. Packaging has one of the largest impacts on our carbon footprint of everything that we do. So it's looking at our packaging and things that we can do from a sustainable mindset is something we had to make sure we included in the inaugural packXplore. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that we thank all of our sponsors again. The session sponsors for this particular session: Berlin Packaging, TricorBraun Winepak, and Wausau Coating. Thank you guys so much for your support. We would not be able to offer a free conference like this without it. Now, as is always the case, just as a reminder, we pre-record these sessions. We do it for two reasons. Number one, we want to make sure it's good quality, but we also want to make sure we have as much engagement as possible. So our speakers are watching this broadcast live, just like you. They're in the chat room, taking your questions as they come in. So please take advantage of that. Our goal is that if you're going to spend some time with us, we want to make sure that you get the most out of it. So please submit those questions and take advantage of that. Now, this session titled Sustainability and Packaging Practice. We've got two great speakers. Jessica Baum. Jessica is the Director of Regenerative Development and Sustainability with Fetzer Vineyards. Of course, Fetzer has been a huge leader with regard to sustainability practices for many years. So Jessica's going to talk a little bit about what they're doing at Fetzer and share that with us. And Jessica's going to be followed by Lucy Pierce. Lucy is the project coordinator for the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. She's going to talk a little bit about that organization and offer some advice on not only how we can get involved, but just how wineries of whatever size can start to make some changes that lower their impact on the environment. I think that's about it. I'm going to hand it off to Jessica and let her take it from here.
This session is sponsored by Berlin Packaging. We believe anything is possible. And TricorBraun Winepak, your global partner in packaging. And Wausau Coated Products, a leading manufacturer of stocked and custom-engineered pressure-sensitive products and label materials designed to meet customer-specific applications.
Thanks so much, George. I'm really happy to be here, and I am here this morning on the live chat, so feel free to ask any questions as we go along, and I will try to answer them in real time. So as George mentioned, I'm Jess Baum, Director of Regenerative Development and Sustainability at Fetzer Vineyards, and we are a longstanding champion of sustainability in all its forms and have been since we were founded in 1968. Fetzer Vineyards was founded by Barney Fetzer in 1968 as a family-owned business with the philosophy, what's good for the earth is good for the grape. And we've been doing that ever since. We've led with that philosophy ever since. And today we are really trying to push ahead beyond sustainability because we know that we live in a world that requires us to make concerted actions in order to stop the climate crisis, which threatens humanity's existence. And so we work to move beyond sustainability into regenerative. And what I mean by that is we work not just to keep the system that we're in going to sustain it, but to actively regenerate it. The goal of which being that everything we do through our business, all of our practices, our farming, the way we treat employees, the way we treat our suppliers, the way that we package our wine and ship it, and the way that it gets to the consumer and has an impact on them. We want all of those things to be regenerative in nature, to be healing, to be actively creating a better world. And we've been doing that in many ways since the beginning. We are a certified B Corp and proud to be so. We're also a benefit corporation. And we recently recertified with an impressive score of 130 B Corp points. We've also been using renewable energy, 100% renewable energy, since 1999, and we were the first winery in the US to be doing that. And we've been True Zero Waste certified since 2014, and we're also the first winery in the country to do that. Last year, we realized that more effort was needed, and we declared a climate emergency, stating that business couldn't thrive and continue in a world that is in crisis. And that's what we are, in crisis, in the climate crisis. And so we made a commitment in light of this climate emergency to be climate positive by 2030. And I'm really excited to share that as of today, in 2021, we are 52% of the way to being 100% climate positive. So I want to talk a little bit about packaging life cycles. I think it's really easy to pick up a package and think just about what's in your hand and what you're going to do with it after. But really, it's so much more nuanced than that. So really, the whole packaging process starts at the extraction of raw material and resources. So whether it's glass or creating plastic using fossil fuels or paper using trees or bamboo or other fibers, that material is extracted, and that has an impact. That has an impact on our climate, that has an impact on people in various areas, and an impact on the planet. Next is the processing of those resources. So when we're talking about wine, we are talking about the melting down of materials to make glass, which is a very energy-intensive process. From there, we move on to transporting that material. So now our raw glass material has become glass wine bottles, and it's at the factory where it was made, but it has to get to the place where the wine is going to be bottled. So it's transported. And glass, for instance, is a very heavy material. And so transportation has a higher cost and a higher emissions cost from a greenhouse gas perspective. Next is the manufacturing process, which for us happens in Hopland, California, where all of our wine is pressed and bottled and created. And there are obviously emissions associated with that and all sorts of impacts. There's waste potentially. There's greenhouse gas emissions, like I said. There's using electricity, which can have an impact on the grid and other people. Next goes to distribution, which again is the shipping of this material. And once glass is filled with a liquid, it becomes even heavier. So there's a heavy price to pay there from an emissions perspective. And then lastly, we talk about use. So putting wine in the fridge, essentially, or putting it in a glass and needing to wash the glass. And then lastly, we talk about end of life, which really can be looked at in two different ways. Reuse, in which case we are starting the cycle all over again, or waste, in which case we're ending the cycle. A lot of people like to call this cradle to cradle versus cradle to grave. Cradle to cradle being where end of life is the beginning of reuse and new life, and cradle to grave being a linear system in which a material goes to a landfill and is never heard from again. So, as I mentioned, there are impacts and emissions at each of these stages. And I think that for a long time, we've had this idea of there being good packaging and bad packaging. And what I'd like to present is this idea that it's not so simple, and that we have to assess so much more than recyclability. So talking more deeply about glass and looking at it from that life cycle perspective, there are some great pros that come with packaging wine in glass. For one, it's endlessly recyclable. What that means is that while a plastic container degrades with every time it's recycled and is limited to maybe being recycled once or twice before it's no longer useful and becomes waste, glass is endlessly recyclable. I could take this glass jar and I could recycle it 1,000 times and it would never degrade or be any less quality glass. So that reduces the amount of raw material needed for extraction. Unlike plastic, which is not infinitely recyclable and therefore requires us to make more plastic. Additionally, glass is more reliably recycled than other alternatives. We have some issues with recycling infrastructure in our country and elsewhere, where just because we're putting something in the recycling bin doesn't mean that we feel confident that it is actively being recycled and finding new life. But glass is one of those things that is more reliably recycled than, for instance, many plastics. Also, wine in glass bottles looks good. And lastly, it's perceived to be more eco-friendly. Many people for a long time have believed that glass products are superior from an environmental perspective, from a quality perspective. However, there are some cons associated with glass packaging. For one, it's super heavy, as I mentioned before. And so this significantly increases the amount of energy that it takes to transport it from one place to the next. You can think about it like if you have a heavier package and you take it to FedEx to ship, it's going to cost more than a lighter package. And that's because it takes them more energy, more emissions to get it from point A to point B. So usually when we're talking about transportation, higher costs are also associated with higher emissions. Glass creates more transportation-based emissions than its lighter counterparts. Additionally, glass manufacturing is a very energy-intense process. In order to recycle this glass right here and transform it into something else, it has to be melted down at a very high temperature. And melting down glass takes a lot of heat, takes a lot of energy. And so there's a lot of emissions associated with that, even with the recycling of glass. Lastly, it breaks more easily. What that means is that there's potentially more waste, but also it requires more packaging in order to be shipped safely. So more paper, more whatever you're using to pad it and make sure that it's not breaking. So last spring, we did a packaging refresh for our flagship brand, Fetzer. And we did this to bring sustainability to the forefront. We know that this is something that younger consumers and older consumers alike are craving and want in products. And it's something that we have authentically been doing for over 50 years. And so we wanted to bring it to the forefront of our packaging and to allow the consumer to understand some of what we do and why we do it and how we do it. And so with this new idea that our wines, our Fetzer wines, they taste good and they do good, we really highlighted this. We highlighted our B Corp certification. We're now certified climate neutral for all Fetzer wines, True Zero Waste certified. We're doing better for people and for our planet. And this really speaks to our legacy of better business commitments. Additionally, when we made this change, we switched glass bottles for many of our varietals. So we went from this older version of our Chardonnay to this new refreshed packaging. So as I mentioned before, we have the new label, we have the new capsule that features B Corp, and the new label features a tree and water really connecting us to those natural resources that we're so aware of in the generation and production of wine. Additionally, this older bottle was a heavier glass. It was a traditional glass wine bottle, the kind that you've seen for many, many years. It really expressed Fetzer's heritage in many ways. And lastly, this was from a glass supplier located quite far from us. So not only were we shipping a heavier material, but we were shipping it a farther distance on ship, actually. So literally shipping it. When we did this bottle refresh, we also developed new technologies in order to lightweight our glass, to reduce the need for it to be as thick in certain areas while maintaining its integrity and maintaining its approachability and its style. And so we were able to reduce the weight of our new glass by 14.8% from our old glass. What this did was give us a total of 15.7% reduction in the carbon footprint of this wine from the old Chardonnay to the new, just by changing the bottle. This came from an 11% reduction in transportation emissions and a 7.9% reduction in the emissions associated with the materials, because as I mentioned, creating glass, recycling glass is an energy-intensive process. So when you use less glass, you use less energy. And that reduction in transportation emissions of 11% was mostly because of the weight of the wine, but it also came from us shipping the wine bottles a shorter distance. So closing that distance a little bit, lightweighting the bottle, and significantly reducing our emissions. So lastly, what I want to leave you with is a challenge. So we've talked a lot here about all of the nuances associated with different kinds of packaging. And I've walked you through our case study, which really looks deep at the greenhouse gas implications and emissions implications of changing our packaging, of lightweighting our glass. But we really have to broaden our perspective beyond what we can see. For instance, is plastic worse than glass? Is glass worse than plastic? It's a much more complicated debate than can be decided in black and white terms. So what I propose is that it's of critical importance that we educate our consumers about packaging sustainability and that we begin to communicate some of these nuances and to communicate so that consumers can be more aware of the new technology and the new science to describe packaging and what is and isn't sustainable. So just as we leverage our brands in order to promote doing good in the world, to promote better business for people and planet, we also have to use our business to educate consumers, to better understand what is the more sustainable option and to better communicate all of the complexities and nuances of these choices. So the challenge that I leave you with is really a couple of different questions. Number one, what one change can you make to significantly improve the environmental impact of the packaging that you produce and purchase? And I ask you this not just potentially as a wine producer or wine consumer, but as a consumer in general who goes to the store and buys laundry detergent and all sorts of other things. How can we broaden our perspective on how we can improve environmental impact through packaging? Lastly, how can we collectively work to shift the wine consumer's perception of packaging and wine quality to expect higher quality wines in lighter packaging? Because that often is an issue, right? That the consumer wants a heavier glass because it feels more expensive rather than paying more for a wine that comes in a bottle that feels cheap. So there's a lot of education there to do. So thank you so much for joining us today. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you have questions for me after this, please feel free to reach out via my email, which you can see right here. Have a great day. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jessica. That was really interesting and some really exciting things that you're doing at Fetzer. Thank you for your leadership in this particular category. Next up, Lucy Pierce. Lucy, again, is a project coordinator for the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. And without any further delay, I'm going to hand it off to Lucy.
Thanks, George. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Lucy Pierce, and I work for Green Blue, a nonprofit dedicated to the sustainable use of materials in society. Specifically, I'm a project coordinator with the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, one of the work streams at Green Blue. Green Blue is the umbrella organization for a few different projects, including the How to Recycle label, the Recycled Material Standard, Clean Ingredients, and of course, the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. The SPC is a membership-based nonprofit that encompasses the entire supply chain. Like our members and many of you in the audience today, we are passionate about creating packaging that is good for people and the environment. We have over 500 members in our organization and are growing. Our members are everyone from material manufacturers to brand owners and retailers. We work with packaging suppliers, waste management professionals, government agencies, universities, and others. I know we have some overlap with members of the Wine Industry Network, so I'm very excited to talk with you all today. I wanted to highlight a few of our biggest projects at the SPC, especially ones related to the wine industry. We recently released our Guide to EPR Proposals, which is an interactive guide that is designed to help folks understand the recent bills and policy proposals around extended producer responsibility for packaging in the United States. This resource is open and free to anyone. You don't need to be a member of the SPC to access it. We have a few projects for members only, including the Goals database, which has over 2,000 goals and commitments made by roughly 350 manufacturers, brand owners, and retailers. If you are crafting sustainability goals, this resource is especially helpful to understand the current goal-setting landscape. We also have mapping resources, education courses, collaborative industry groups, and lots of written guidelines for things like recycled content and compostable packaging that are accessible to members and non-members alike. So enough about us, let's get into why we are here today. Let's talk about sustainable packaging and its relevance to the wine industry. Since I'm kicking us off, I wanted to start by doing some level setting to get us all on the same page. For us at the SPC, that generally means, why packaging? Overall, packaging does one thing. It protects what's inside of it. But sustainable packaging also protects your brand. Sustainable packaging is a strong driver for sustainability-minded shoppers. Marketing research firm Nielsen has found evidence that sustainable packaging attributes, like recycled content, drive product sales. Increasingly, the line between sustainable products and sustainable packaging is blurred. Consumer research shows that sustainability is really becoming mainstream. NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business examined US consumers' actual purchasing of consumer packaged goods and found that 50% of CPG growth from 2013 to 2018 came from sustainability marketed products. In more than 90% of the CPG categories, sustainably marketed products grew faster than their conventional counterparts. In a recent McKinsey article, they found 1 out of 4 consumers say they are planning to focus more on environmental issues and will pay more attention to social aspects in their shopping behavior, even through the global pandemic. Sustainability has not been brushed aside with COVID, and it's not just millennials who want it anymore. Smart companies recognize that packaging plays an important role in corporate sustainability strategy because it can have a number of unwanted environmental and social impacts at every stage of its life cycle. These impacts begin with how packaging is sourced. In the case of paper, tree fiber may be sourced from high-risk areas, such as illegally logged areas, high environmental value areas with biodiversity or endangered species, or areas that may have been converted from a forest to a non-forested area. It is important to know where your fiber is coming from. Next, we need to consider how packaging is designed and manufactured, and the impacts of any intentional or unintentionally added chemicals. For example, certain paints, inks, and dyes contain unintentionally produced PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. And PCBs have been found in a number of packaging and paper products. This is a problem because PCBs don't break down once they're in the environment. They are present in soils and water all over the world and can be especially harmful to higher food chain animals like orcas. When it comes to the recovery of packaging, many developed economies have robust domestic markets for high-value materials like bottles and cans. But low-value materials, especially mixed plastics, have traditionally been exported to developing countries like Indonesia. In some cases, these countries lack adequate waste management systems and have no option but to dispose of waste by open burning, open-air dumps, or dumping into rivers and streams. As these examples illustrate, packaging often carries unintended social and environmental consequences, and these consequences make packaging a key business issue. Let's dive into some of the most important opportunities for increasing the sustainability of your packaging. We should think about the whole life cycle of a package. The more circular we think, then the less material we will waste and the more value we will be able to recover. So we start with sourcing. Where are the materials coming from? How are we manufacturing it? What about the transportation and distribution of packaging to warehouses and retail environments? How does the consumer experience the package, and do they know what to do with it? And what options are available for consumers to recycle or compost it? To make packaging more sustainable, we need to turn to creative ways of improving how packaging is sourced, designed, and recovered. Starting back at the beginning, sourcing. Where are the materials that we use for the packaging coming from? Let's start with glass. I'm sure many of you know this, but just to recap, glass used for packaging applications is often called container glass or soda lime glass. Soda lime glass is the most common form of glass produced. It is composed of about 70% silica, 15% soda, and 9% lime, with much smaller amounts of various other compounds. The soda serves as a flux to lower the temperature at which the silica melts, and then the lime acts as a stabilizer for the silica. One of the downsides to sourcing glass is that riverbeds are excavated for sand, causing erosion and water contamination. Often this sand comes from countries with little ability to enforce environmental regulation. Sand is the second most extracted resource from the earth. And recycled glass can be substituted for 95% of raw materials in a new package. So new packaging can be made almost entirely from recycled glass. Recycled glass can be reprocessed at lower temperatures than manufacturing glass from virgin sand, and lower temperatures mean less energy is used in the manufacturing process. In general, we can save over 300 tons of carbon per 1,000 ton of recycled glass. In Sweden, 97% of glass is recycled, and Absolut Vodka produces about 600,000 bottles a day. 40% of the Absolut Vodka bottle is recycled glass, which reduces the energy consumption by about 10% in the energy-intensive glass manufacturing process. The bottles are produced in the nearest glassworks to the factory, and they have one of the lowest global energy consumption rates among large distilleries. This is due to their use of recycled glass, and they also use the heat produced during the process in the fermentation and distillation process. The 40% recycled content is impressive compared to the global averages of 23% recycled content in glass bottles. This is a map from the Glass Packaging Institute showing glass infrastructure in the United States. As you can see, there's a decent number of glass manufacturers and recycling processors in California, lots in the Great Lakes, Midwest area, and very few in the Great Plains and Western states. Because glass is very heavy compared to other materials, it is really important to think about the transportation and its impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. According to Eunomia Research's 50 States of Recycling report released earlier this year, California's recycling rate of glass bottles and jars is about 54%. This is relatively high, but the beverage container recycling program in the state does not include wine bottles, so most wine bottles are likely to be recycled curbside or at drop-off locations. Markets for glass collected through single-stream curbside collections have been challenged in recent years, with some municipalities even dropping glass from their services entirely. The Northeast Recycling Council conducted a study in 2018 that showed only 54% of glass collected and processed through MRFs in the Northeast went to a glass processor, and only 0.02% to an actual glass recycling container manufacturer. 15% was landfilled, 24% was used as alternative daily cover at a landfill, and 8% was used as aggregate for construction. MRF glass is generally very contaminated and is difficult to reprocess back into bottled glass. Now let's talk about another common packaging format, aluminum. Virgin aluminum production starts with mining bauxite, which happens in places like Brazil and China, as well as some in Australia. This is problematic for two reasons. One, those places are all very far from North America if you're manufacturing products in this region. And two, mining practices in Brazil and China are considered below US industry standard and often cause significant disruption to ecosystems. When you create aluminum from bauxite, you also generate a large amount of smelting waste that becomes landfilled. If you are sourcing virgin aluminum, it's necessary to pay close attention to where you're sourcing from. The Aluminum Stewardship Initiative was launched in 2015 to create a standard for sustainable aluminum sourcing and chain of custody in the supply chain. It defines environmental, social, and governance principles to address sustainability issues. ASI now facilitates a certification program, and you can find out more information on their website. Approximately 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the aluminum industry worldwide relate to the smelting process. As energy costs are a major part of overall production costs, improved energy efficiency is essential for the aluminum industry, both from an economic and environmental point of view. Each year in the United States, nearly 40 billion cans, $800 million worth of aluminum ends up in landfills. Globally, that number is closer to $1 billion. As a brand or retailer, you can specify recycled content from manufacturers, but recycled content can vary greatly by manufacturer. Novelis is the world's largest producer of aluminum can sheeting, for instance. They currently use an average of 55%, which has increased over the years. But it's really important to know the recycled content of your packaging. So we've talked a bit about sourcing, and now we're going to talk about optimization. To help us think through sustainable packaging, it's critical to ask the question, what is the job that we hire a package to do? There's a handful of answers that probably apply to your company, but here are a few that we think are important. Product damage of any sort is a huge problem. If the product is damaged or spoiled, it can't be sold, and all of that energy from extraction, processing, manufacturing, and transportation is wasted. Environmental factors to consider that impact packaging and its ability to protect the product are related to the transportation and distribution of the product. This chart demonstrates optimization, not minimization. You want that sweet spot where your product is not over or underpacked. I wanted to touch on one form of optimization that can be relevant to wine packaging, and that's volumetric efficiency. Analysis of e-commerce packages show that in some categories, parcels can contain up to 40% air. In other categories, that number can be even higher. This issue for e-commerce comes in part for the need to ship packaging that is not designed for shipping. That is, the primary package that normally sits on store shelves is not designed for parcel delivery. An option to improve volumetric efficiency is to innovate the primary package. In the UK, Garçon Wines has developed a rectangular wine bottle designed to allow unattended delivery through mail slots and letterboxes. This format allows a space-efficient delivery of a single wine bottle. In e-commerce, this means that you can fit more cases in a smaller amount of space in vans for the last mile of delivery to your home or apartment. The bottles are also made from 100% recycled PET, offering significant savings in greenhouse gas emissions and energy. There is limited available research that clearly analyzes the environmental impacts of e-commerce packaging versus brick and mortar. However, packaging is likely to have a bigger environmental impact in e-commerce. What we do know is that sustainable packaging interventions can help reduce the environmental impacts. Things like increasing volumetric efficiency and optimal use of materials. Now, thinking about recovery, When you design for recovery, you grow your own feedstock. You want to create packaging that you would want to buy back as recycled content. Here's an example of what we mean by that. On the left, label ink and label adhesive stain the color of the PET, and the label is not fully liberated from the PET flake. On the right, a packaging producer has chosen a label that doesn't stain the PET and fully separates. This is one example of how the decisions you make in the design process have consequences later in the terms of recyclability. What is recyclable? Is a material recyclable if it can be sorted correctly and processed? Is a material recyclable only if it fits for another use? Is a material recyclable only if it has an end market? We at SBC have a definition of what recyclable is, but even then, it isn't black and white because of these philosophical issues and how they play out in real life. Is it recyclable? Does it mean it's collected? Does it mean that it's made into something new? These questions are very closely tied to what companies actually do with their packaging. One of the main points we want to get across is that you can't just make a bunch of changes to a material and then assume that it's still recyclable. I wanted to start with an example to show the complexity of what is recyclable. Here are some great examples of packages that have a recyclable base material, but they've become less recyclable. The can on the left is obviously aluminum, a widely recyclable material. However, it has a full body shrink sleeve over the can as the label. Full body shrink sleeve labels generally must be removed from the can before recycling. The wine bottles on the left also utilize full body shrink sleeves and can make recycling the glass more difficult. So these are some good examples of materials that have been compromised for recycling by design decisions. Another case where good packaging can go bad is when not all components are recyclable. Even if you have certain components of a package that on their own in isolation are recyclable, that doesn't necessarily mean that the package as a whole is recyclable. Here's one example. Bag-in-a-box wine generally has a recyclable cardboard outer box and a multi-layer bag inside with the plastic spout. The cardboard is widely recyclable, but if the consumer does not remove the bag inside before placing the package in their curbside bin, this entire package becomes unrecyclable. It's important to keep in mind that just because you can technically recycle something, you can grind it up and make it into something new, that's not the only consideration for whether something is recyclable. It really is all about the context of the system that you're operating in. Here we have an example of packages that are technically recyclable, but are not really recyclable through our current infrastructure. The bottle on the left is made from glass, but it can't be sorted correctly due to the color. Black blends into the MRF conveyor belts and is extremely difficult for sorters to see. Our recycling infrastructure simply wasn't designed to accommodate that type of item. In addition, glass that is not flint, amber, or green is really not desired by glass reprocessors. And on the right, we have a multi-layer carton with a plastic cap. The cap by itself would just drop through the metal grates that recyclables flow over at a material recovery facility. And the cartons themselves are a combination of paper, plastics, and metallized layers, which can only be separated through a very specific process that is expensive, and not many fiber processors in the United States have the capacity to do so. And the last point on recyclability, just because a community says it accepts a package does not mean that it's recyclable. For example, take number 3 plastic, PVC. Many curbside programs say they accept 1 through 7s. But PVC is harmful to the recycling stream because it contains chloride, which can turn into chlorine gas if processed in certain ways. It can be accepted, but it's definitely not recyclable. So I don't want to end with all doom and gloom on what can really be recycled. So as my last point, I wanted to touch on the intricacies of life cycle assessments. First, what is a life cycle assessment, or LCA? Broadly speaking, LCA is a technique to assess environmental impacts associated with various stages of a product's life. Here, the word product does not mean a consumer product, but rather a material or packaging item or type. With a quick search on the internet, there are many specific LCAs to wine out there. This one, for example, was conducted in Italy, but I found some in other locations like Texas, Indiana, Canada. In addition to public research, you can conduct your own LCAs, which will give you specific information for your packaging in particular. There, of course, are various data points you will need to conduct an LCA, like material type, material weight, converting method, the distances traveled, and types or modes of transportation. If you are interested in learning more about your packaging's fossil fuel consumption, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, aquatic toxicity, and other environmental impacts, you should definitely conduct life cycle assessments to get a picture of how and where sustainability improvements can be made. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jessica Baum at Fetzer Winery to continue our discussion of sustainable packaging and wine.